Some people just don't belong here.
Fire every one of them. The breach didn't come from Elijah's computer. Then whose terminal was it? Brad Doyle.
Meet my son, Elijah Monroe, the next chairman of Whitmore Logistics.
No, that can't be.
I'm not here to punish silence. I'm here to make sure no one has to survive in silence again.
Does that mean the records can be fixed?
Thanks for watching. Follow A Brighter Destiny for more powerful stories, and don't forget to subscribe.
Box in Elijah Monroe's arms held almost nothing at all. Dented steel water bottle, a phone charger wound twice around itself, and a single manila folder with the corners gone soft from handling. Plotty walked through the front doors of Whitmore Logistics at 3:52 in the afternoon. While laughter followed him across the open floor, the kind of laughter people only allow themselves when they believe the outcome has already been decided in their favor. Ed Danvers stood near the revolving doors with her arms crossed and a small, satisfied smile on her face, the smile of someone who had just closed a file she never expected to have to reopen. Elijah stepped onto the granite stairs outside, set the box down on the low wall beside the entrance, and reached into his jacket pocket for his phone. Made one call. His voice did not shake. It was level, almost gentle, the voice of a man ordering coffee rather than a man who had just been fired for something he did not do. It said 4 words. Fire every one of them. Behind him, through the glass, the building had no idea it was already coming apart. Elijah Monroe had been back in Atlanta for 19 days when he walked into Whitmore Logistics' downtown headquarters on Peachtree Street, carrying nothing but a canvas messenger bag and a last name that meant nothing to the people working there, because he had made sure of it. He had spent 6 years overseas in Lagos and later in Rotterdam, doing the unglamorous work of fixing broken supply chains for companies that did not know his father's name either. It was work that taught him more about how organizations actually function than any boardroom ever could have. When his father, Richard Whitmore, finally called and said the time had come, Elijah did not ask for a corner office, but he asked for a cubicle on the 9th floor and a plain employee badge that opened nothing but the stairwell and the break room. Richard Whitmore was 73 years old. Had built Whitmore Logistics from 3 delivery trucks in 1984 into one of the largest privately held freight and warehousing companies in the Southeast. And for the last 18 months, he had been quietly preparing to hand it to someone, though almost no one inside the company knew the process had already begun. Richard had one condition for whoever would take the chair after him. That person had to understand the company from the floor up, not from the top down. Elijah did not argue. It was the same principle that had shaped every job he had ever taken. On a Monday morning at 8:40, Elijah showed up in a gray hoodie, dark jeans, and a pair of work boots that were clean but clearly not new. He told the HR coordinator, a soft-spoken man named Gary, that he was a temporary operations associate. Gary handed him a badge, pointed toward the elevator bank, and went back to his coffee. But he looked twice. That was exactly the point. The 9th floor housed the mid-level operations team, project coordinators, compliance officers, data analysts, a cluster of administrative staff managing vendor communication and internal reporting. It was not the floor with the view. It was the floor where the actual company lived, the connective tissue. Nobody photographed for the annual report. If something was wrong with the culture at Whitmore Logistics, Elijah knew it would show up here first. His direct supervisor was Priya Danvers, a woman in her mid-40s who wore her authority the way some people wear an expensive coat, fitted precisely to her and no one else. On his first morning, she looked him over once, said he would be handling data consolidation for the quarterly compliance report, and handed him a stack of files that were already 3 days overdue. Then she walked away, before he could ask a single question. Data was a mess, duplicate entries, missing source tag, numbers that did not reconcile across departments. None of it was difficult, only tedious, and Elijah spent the better part of that first day working through it in near silence while the floor moved around him like he was furniture. By the end of week 1, he noticed the shape of the place. It was an inner circle, Priya at its center, flanked by Brad Doyle and Claire Nash. And then there was everyone else. Brad was loud and loose with opinions, the kind of man who said cruel things and packaged them as jokes so no one could call him on it without looking humorless. Claire said less, but she watched everything, and she never spoke unless it aligned her with whoever held the most influence in the room. Here is the detail that mattered, the one Elijah did not fully understand until much later. There was one more layer beneath the office politics, a layer nobody at Whitmore Logistics said out loud, but everyone somehow already knew. When work came out of Elijah's desk that was clean and sharp and finished ahead of schedule, people were surprised in a way they tried to hide and mostly failed to. Brad once said, not unkindly, not cruelly, just carelessly, that Elijah must have had help, because guys who looked like him usually needed it on the compliance side. Nobody in the room reacted. Elijah wrote the comment down that night in a small notebook he kept in his bag, next to the date and the time, 10:14 in the morning, and he kept working. By his second week, Elijah had finished 3 assignments that were originally split among 4 people. He did not announce it. He simply dropped the completed reports into the shared drive, formatted cleanly, and moved on to the next thing. 2 days after that, he overheard Brad telling Priya that the consolidated vendor report, the one Elijah had spent 11 hours restructuring, had been praised by the compliance director on a call that morning. Brad took full credit without so much as a flicker of hesitation. Priya nodded approvingly and CC'd Brad on the follow-up email to senior leadership. Elijah's name did not appear anywhere in that thread. He read the email once, closed the laptop, and went to refill his water bottle. He was not surprised. He was paying attention. Those are different things, and the difference between them would matter enormously in about 3 weeks. Over the following days, a pattern set itself into place with almost no variation at all. Anything that turned out well got claimed by someone else, usually Brad, sometimes Claire, occasionally Priya herself. Anything that went sideways, a missed deadline, a misrouted vendor file, a miscommunication between departments, found its way back to Elijah's desk as his fault, whether or not he had touched it. The floor had a well-worn system for this. Mistakes needed a name attached before they reached Priya's inbox, and the name attached was almost always the person with the least standing in the room to argue back. There was a woman on the team named Angela Reeves, early 30s, 6 years at the company, careful and precise in her work. One Tuesday afternoon, she made a minor formatting error on a regulatory filing, the kind of error corrected in 90 seconds. Priya called it out in front of the entire floor anyway, her voice carrying just enough edge to make sure every desk within 30 feet heard it. Angela sat very still, said yes, she understood. She would fix it immediately. After Priya walked away, Angela stared at her monitor for a long moment without moving a muscle. Elijah watched that stillness and understood something about it that had nothing to do with the formatting error at all. It was the practiced stillness of someone who had learned, over years, that any visible reaction would be used against her later. Filed that moment away, too, next to everything else. There was a quieter cruelty running underneath all of it. Her lunch plans, made just loudly enough for Elijah to hear, and then finalized in a way that made it obvious he had not been invited. Questions in meetings designed not to gather information, but to expose a gap, asked publicly, so any stumble became evidence in a teaser case that was already being built. Deliverables assigned at 4:47 in the afternoon. Due the following morning, always missing enough context to complete cleanly, always leaving enough ambiguity to assign blame if it fell apart. None of it, taken alone, would ever hold up as a formal complaint. That was the design of it. Each incident could be explained away individually. Stacked together, they formed something else entirely, something with structure and intent. Elijah ran 4 miles most mornings before sunrise along the belt line, and he had learned a long time ago to use those quiet hours for thinking rather than just movement. But come into this arrangement expecting the ordinary friction of a large company, politics, inefficiency, the occasional clash of egos. What he found instead was something closer to a managed ecosystem, a hierarchy with rules everyone understood without anyone writing them down, a shared agreement about who was permitted to fail safely and who was not. People below Priya either participated in the system or stayed quiet, because silence was the only form of neutrality the floor allowed. Thought about his father's company not as an heir, but as a man who had spent years studying why organizations fail, and he understood, walking those quiet streets before dawn, that a company could carry strong financials and a respected name while rotting from the middle outward, floor by floor, one silenced employee at a time. His 3rd week, Priya handed him something bigger. She assigned him to lead documentation for an internal data audit, a sensitive project touching 3 departments. Elijah built the tracking framework from nothing, coordinated across teams, and had the initial system running 2 full days ahead of schedule. Shared access credentials with Priya and Brad, so the rest of the team could keep building on it while he finished the final sections. It was a reasonable decision, a professional one. He would understand, before the week was out, exactly how it had been turned into a weapon aimed at him. On Thursday morning, Elijah arrived to find Brad and Claire already seated in Priya's glass-walled office with the blinds drawn, which never happened. HR Director Denise Cole sat across from Priya with a folder open in front of her. Elijah had barely set his bag down when Denise stepped out and asked him to come in. Her face wore the practiced neutrality, sign of someone delivering a message she had not written herself. Denise told him that a significant volume of restricted client data had been accessed and pulled from the audit system over the previous 48 hours, and that the activity traced back to the credentials Elijah had used to build the tracking framework. It was, she said, a clear audit trail. Given the evidence, the company could not continue his employment. Elijah asked to see the audit trail. Denise looked at Priya. Priya said the documentation was with legal pending review and was not available to him. Elijah asked if there was a process to contest the decision. Denise said the termination was immediate and final, and she slid a single page across the desk, asking him to sign that he had received the notice. He read it, and he signed it. He asked for a copy, which she gave him. He thanked her. He did not raise his voice. He did not look at Priya or Brad. He walked back to his desk, placed his water bottle, his charger, and his one folder into a small cardboard box someone had already left waiting for him, and carried it to the elevator without another word. The floor was very quiet on his way out. People were watching without appearing to watch, the way people do when they suspect something is wrong but have not yet decided what to do about it. He stood on the granite steps outside, set the box on the low wall, and pressed call on a contact saved under a single letter. The line picked up on the second ring. Elijah's voice was even, unhurried, entirely without anger. He gave 3 instructions. First, contact General Counsel and convene the board within the hour. Second, place the entire digital record of the 9th floor, every email, every access log, every performance review going back 4 years, under immediate legal hold. But third, the sentence that would move through every hallway of that building before the sun went down. Fire every one of them. The call lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Elijah sat afterward in his car in the underground garage, with the engine off and the box on the passenger seat, looking at nothing in particular. He was not angry, and that surprised people later when they heard the story, though It would not have surprised anyone who actually knew him. Anger requires surprise, and Elijah had not been surprised by a single thing that happened on that floor, but been watching it build for 19 days. What he felt sitting in that garage was something closer to clarity, the particular kind that arrives when a problem you have studied carefully finally shows you its entire shape. Drove home, changed his shirt, and was back in the building. 40 minutes later, this time riding the private elevator from the executive garage level with a code his father had given him on his first day back in the country. It carried him straight to the 32nd floor, where the boardroom and executive suites looked out over the whole skyline in a way the 9th floor never could. Elijah had always believed that was part of the company's problem. People at the top spent too much time looking outward at the market and not enough time looking down at what was actually happening inside their own building. Richard Whitmore was already standing at the head of the boardroom table when his son walked in, because Richard never sat when he was agitated. He wore a dark suit with no tie, his white hair cut close, his posture carrying the particular straightness of a man who had served in the army decades earlier and never fully set it down. Something shifted in his expression when he saw Elijah. Not quite relief, something close to it. General Counsel Frank Delgado was already there with 2 members of the legal team, and 2 board members had joined by video from the far wall screen. Denise Cole had also been summoned, and she sat at the end of the table with the careful composure of someone who understood her role in the room had changed dramatically since that morning. Richard did not open with pleasantries. He confirmed the legal hold was active, that IT security had already begun a parallel audit of the access logs, and that no one on the 9th floor had been told anything had changed. The floor believed it had already won. Elijah stood and walked the room through the last 3 weeks without notes. Pattern of work misappropriation, the deliberate routing of blame, fabricated data breach. He told them about Angela, about the 447 deadlines, about the email chain where Brad took credit for 11 hours of work that was never his. Denise listened without expression, but her hand tightened slightly on the folder in front of her, and Elijah understood she had been handed a decision that morning and told to deliver it without ever being allowed to examine the evidence underneath it. Within the first half hour, Frank's team had the access logs pulled. Data extraction flagged under Elijah's name had been initiated from a device that did not match anything he had ever logged in from. IP address resolved to a workstation registered to Brad Doyle. Someone had obtained Elijah's credentials and used them from Brad's own terminal. It was not sophisticated. It worked only because no one on that floor had ever been examined closely enough to catch it. Richard looked at his son and asked how he wanted to proceed. Elijah said he wanted the company-wide meeting to go forward exactly as planned, with the evidence presented and his own identity revealed to no one beforehand. An all-hands notice went out at 2:15 that afternoon. Mandatory attendance, main atrium, ground floor, 4 class days sharp. The message said only that the founding chairman had an announcement regarding the company's future leadership. Nothing more. In the 2 hours between the notice and the meeting, the building filled with speculation. On the 9th floor, Priya held court near the window bank, in the low, confident register of a woman who considered herself close to important information. She mentioned twice that transitions like this were usually opportunities for people who had already proven their value. Brad laughed at something she said. Claire refreshed her inbox. None of them connected the meeting to the termination they had carried out that same morning, and none of them noticed that Denise Cole had never come back to the floor after her meeting with legal. The atrium filled by 350. Elijah stood in a side corridor with Frank Delgado, watching the crowd through a gap in the partition. You could see Priya near the center, poised with the easy confidence of someone expecting good news, Brad beside her, Claire a few feet back with her arms crossed. Richard Whitmore walked onto the platform at 4 with the unhurried authority of a man who had been doing this for 40 years. The room settled the moment he appeared. He thanked the company for its work, called the building the defining project of his life, and said the decision of who would carry it forward was the most important one he had left to make. Said the next chairman of Whitmore Logistics had been inside this building for the last 19 days. Asked his son to come forward. Elijah walked onto the platform wearing the same gray hoodie and dark jeans he had been fired in that same morning. Carried nothing. He stood beside his father and let the silence settle over the atrium, a total silence, the specific stillness of hundreds of people processing something that fit no category they had prepared for. Riyadh's face, even from that distance, moved through several stages in rapid succession. Recognition first, then calculation, then something with no clean name. Elijah did not deliver a speech. He gave his name's background in brief, and his father's reasoning for asking him to begin as an ordinary employee. He said the last 19 days had been the most instructive of his professional life, and that some of what he had learned required immediate attention. Then he stepped aside and asked Frank Delgado to take the floor. Frank explained, precise and unhurried, that in connection with a personnel matter earlier that day, legal had reviewed records from the 9th floor operations team and uncovered evidence of a fabricated data breach used to terminate an employee without cause, along with a broader pattern the company took extremely seriously. Frank explained, precise and unhurried, that in connection with a personnel matter earlier that day, legal had reviewed records from the 9th floor operations team and uncovered evidence of a fabricated data breach used to terminate an employee without cause, along with a broader pattern the company took extremely seriously. The full review would be complete within 24 hours. But all relevant personnel had already been placed on administrative suspension. Named no one from the platform. The atrium did not erupt. It went very still, the way rooms go still when what is being said is heavy enough that people stop performing their reactions and simply absorb it. Elijah stood there, thinking about Angela sitting at her desk with a controlled face, absorbing a public correction that had nothing to do with her competence. Alden thought. He thought about everyone else on that floor who had endured this for years, calculating the price of speaking up, and about the fact that not one of them had ever felt safe enough to file a complaint that actually went anywhere. That was not an accident. That was the design. After the meeting cleared, a member of the legal team handed him a preliminary 12-page summary. Read every page, standing right there on the emptying platform. It showed was worse than what he had personally witnessed. Manipulated performance evaluations going back 4 years. Documented cases of Priya approving negative reviews for employees who had filed informal complaints about the team's culture. 2 of those employees had left the company. 1 had accepted a quiet settlement. Credit theft had been rerouted through internal reporting, so consistently it looked less like habit and more like architecture. Brad's name appeared in more than 30 inflated project summaries. Claire's in 19, mostly the administrative machinery that made the misattribution hard to trace. Tia sat above all of it, approving, directing, occasionally doing the work herself. Elijah handed the summary back and asked how long the full audit would take. 12 to 16 hours. He said he would be in at 6 the next morning. Was at his desk on the 32nd floor by 5:55. Frank arrived at 6:10 with the completed audit bound in a folder and a copy on a secured drive. They worked through it together for 2 hours. The picture was worse than expected. Over 4 years, Priya's team had suppressed the advancement of at least 11 employees through manipulated scores. 3 had filed informal complaints, all 3 routed. Whether by design or by a broken reporting structure, straight back to Priya's own level, where they were logged as resolved without any real investigation. One employee had left after a sudden, poorly substantiated negative review appeared in her file 2 weeks after she raised a concern. Another had been quietly moved to a different floor after what the records described only as a personnel discussion. A third had taken a confidential settlement. None of the 3 had been contacted by the company since. Denise Cole's name appeared in 2 of those 3 complaint files as the HR point of contact, a detail Elijah noted and set aside for a separate, careful conversation. He asked Frank what the legal exposure looked like if the company chose to manage this quietly instead of acting. Frank said it was significant and growing. If it ever became known the company had this evidence and sat on it, every one of those cases could reopen with teeth. That was not the direction Elijah was considering. The real question in front of him was not whether to act. It had already been decided the moment he read Angela's name in the file. The question was scope. Firing Priya, Brad, and Claire was straightforward, the evidence specific and documented. The audit had surfaced 4 more employees who had participated at varying levels, some actively, some through a silence that had protected the system rather than disrupted it. 2 of those 4 had themselves been targeted by Priya's circle in earlier years before finding it easier to align with the structure than keep resisting it. That history did not excuse them, but it complicated what accountability was supposed to look like inside an environment built to make integrity expensive. Denise Cole required the most careful judgment of all. Whether she had actively buried those complaints or simply failed to escalate them was a distinction the audit could document, but not fully resolve. Elijah decided she would remain in her role under formal review, with the outcome determining her future at the company. It was the harder line to draw, but it was the correct one. Acting on incomplete evidence in either direction would set the wrong precedent for how decisions got made under his leadership from that point forward. Mid-morning, the terminations were finalized. Priya Danvers, Brad Doyle, Claire Nash, and the 4 additional employees named in the audit. Each notice would carry specific documented conduct, not a vague separation letter. 2 former employees who had left after filing complaints would be contacted directly within the week, and the company would make them whole. The employee who had accepted a settlement would be contacted too. Elijah told Frank he wanted the process handled with care, not speed. The goal was to make it right, not to close the file quickly. 9. Elijah rode down to the 9th floor for the first time since his own termination the day before, but not announced it. He stood for a moment near the entrance, looking at the empty desks that had belonged to Priya, Brad, and Claire, and at the rest of the floor working at half capacity. Present, but not really working. Waiting. He walked to the center of the floor and asked everyone to gather. It took less than a minute. People arranged themselves in a loose semicircle, some standing, some pulling chairs over, all of them watching him with a careful attention of people who had learned that expressions were never free, did not stand behind a desk or a podium, spoke at a normal volume, plainly. He told them the audit was complete, the termination decisions were made, and they were final. He was not there to explain himself or ask for approval. He was there because the people in that room had worked inside a particular environment for years. Some of them harmed by it, and he thought they deserved to hear it directly from him rather than through a company memo. He told them the evaluation system on that floor was suspended immediately, and every performance record from the last 4 years would be reviewed by an independent HR team before any of it was used for anything going forward. Said a new reporting channel would open within the week, one that bypassed managers entirely and went straight to legal and to him. Asked if there were questions. Angela raised her hand first. She asked whether the review would affect decisions already made, promotions already denied, roles already given to someone else. Elijah said yes, that the review existed specifically to identify and correct outcomes where the record showed the evaluation had been shaped by the conduct under investigation. Angela nodded and lowered her hand, and something in her expression shifted, not dramatically, just a small release of something she had been holding carefully in place for a very long time. Elijah noticed it. He did not comment on it. He noticed it, and that was enough. The project coordinator near the back, 3 years on the floor, asked whether people who had stayed silent would be penalized. It was a fair question, and Elijah answered it directly. Review focused on documented participation in misconduct, not on silence. Report. He said he understood that silence in that environment had never been a neutral choice, that it had been a survival strategy, and he was not interested in punishing people for calculating what it would cost them to speak when the system offered no safe way to do it. What he wanted was to make sure that calculation never had to happen again. A few people around the coordinator visibly exhaled. That afternoon, Priya called the main legal line, asking for Elijah directly. Frank relayed the message and asked how he wanted to handle it. Elijah said to put her through. The call lasted 11 minutes. Priya did not open with an apology. She opened with context, the pressure she had inherited, the expectations from above, the competitive culture that predated her. Elijah listened without interrupting. When she finished, he told her he had read the full audit, including records that predated the most recent incidents, and the pattern it documented was not the product of pressure from anyone above her. It was a sustained choice, 4 years long, that had cost real people their careers and in some cases their livelihoods. Her decision would not change. She said she had given the company 8 years. Said he understood, and that the severance terms matched both her contract and the company's obligations, and he thanked her for calling. Brad never called. Claire sent a written request through her attorney arguing her role had been administrative rather than directive. Frank's team responded with the relevant pages of the audit attached, and nothing else. At the end of that first week, the independent HR review had begun. Elijah had built a direct reporting line that bypassed the old management structure entirely while new team leads were vetted. He had quietly restored 2 employees to roles they had been passed over for, telling them only that the company had re-evaluated the decision and wanted to discuss a different path forward. Both accepted. Richard came to the office that Friday afternoon for no scheduled reason at all. Walked the building with his son for about an hour, floor by floor, asking questions and listening more than talking. Near the end, standing together at the window on the 32nd floor, with the city going gold in the late light, Richard said he had spent 4 decades building something and had feared, these last few years, that it was coming apart in ways he could no longer see from where he sat. Elijah said he understood that now. Richard said he had no doubt his son would handle it correctly. Elijah said he was not certain of that, only that he intended to stay close to the floor, to keep looking at what was actually happening, rather than what the reports claimed was happening. Richard nodded slowly and said that had always been the right instinct. He had simply stopped trusting it in himself once the company grew large enough that looking down became uncomfortable. The cardboard box Elijah had carried out through the front doors was still sitting in the back seat of his car 2 weeks later. One evening, after the building had emptied and the only light left on the 32nd floor was the one above his own desk, he went down and brought it up. He set the water bottle by the window. He plugged in the charger, filed the folder in the cabinet beside his desk. None of it was significant on its own, but there was something worth keeping in having it visible, a small reminder of a place designed to make him feel like he did not belong there, kept in the room where he now decided who did. A leader is not remembered for the moment they reveal what power they were holding, are remembered for what they choose to do with it afterward. Who they protect, who they make whole. What kind of place they leave standing for the people who will still be there long after the names on the termination letters have been forgotten. Elijah understood that now in a way he had not fully understood before he walked through those front doors in a gray hoodie and asked for a desk on the 9th floor. Work had only just begun, but it had begun honestly, and honesty was the only foundation that had ever held anything of real value. For Kleiner, this story is a work of fiction. All names, characters, businesses, and events depicted are products of the imagination and are used fictitiously. The resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual companies or events is purely coincidental. This story is intended to illustrate broader themes of workplace dignity, fairness, and the harm caused by bias and mistreatment, and is not a factual account of any real individual or organization.